I guess we should start with the next panel, panel 3, Conceptualizing Interfaces of Affection. I'm the chair of this session since Oliver Leisert has fallen sick, and I have also to announce that Katrin Friedrich is ill and is not able to join our conference. And she's told me when I talked to her on the phone 2 days ago that I should send her wishes to the network members and that she's very unhappy about not being, part of this last conference. So conceptualizing interfaces of affection. And in some way or the other, it continues with the discussion we had just heard in the morning lecture. It's about the two sides, the human side and the machine, the side of the machine, and the way the affective is designed on the human side and, of course, on the machinic side. And we have two experts for this interfacing problem, Dawid Kasprowicz. And Dawid is a research associate at the Institute for Philosophy of Digital Media at the University Witten-Herdecke. And prior to that, he worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Media Culture of Computer Simulation in Lüneburg. Actually, that's where we've met and where the network had one of its conferences. His research interests are the media history of immersion, media theory of embodiment, and digital media and human-robot collaborations. And the title of his paper, Encoding Proximity, Intuition in Human-Robot Collaborations. Please, Dawid.
Yes, thank you very much, Marie-Luise. Thanks very much for the organizers for this invitation. And it's been a very wonderful stay so far. I'm just gonna say one short thing. Well, it's about human-robot collaborations, but as we all might know, robots do not collaborate immediately. Most of the time they collapse. But this is the reality. I'm just saying that because what I will do right now is getting a bit deeper into the discourse in the engineering science of collaborative robots. So if on the one or the other hand these things sound as they have already been implemented, it's not the fact, but the fact is that this discourse is going on, and there's this particular movement that is interested in this relation between the conceptualizing of robots and the materialization of robots. And one very important concept here is the concept of intuition, and that's what I would like to start with. And I start with a quote. "I am not convinced that artificial intelligence is going to replace us. You can't program intuition, a gut instinct. So the AI might get very intelligent, but I hope as a human I continue to get intelligent and not stand at the standstill." This quote from Sarah Seward, customer representative at the online test prep company Magoosh, stems from a New York Times article entitled "Meet the People Who Train the Robots to Do Their Own Jobs," published online on April 28th this year. Both the article and the quote point out to the current scenarios of imminent unemployment through what one might call the invasion of robots into factories, hospitals, or service agencies. This is, so far, the main subject dominating the public debates about industrial and social robots in the Western countries. However, I would like to emphasize a different point than the possible replacements of human workers by robots. The point I would like to focus upon in the next minutes is a media anthropological effect around the notion of intuition in human-robot collaborations. In times of highly technologized environments, intuition represents a kind of a last resort of a genuine human effect. Having intuition and being intuitive cannot be programmed, as Sarah Seward said in the New York Times article. On the one hand, intuition is a deeply non-rational but human way of reasoning, close to an instinct but not innate. On the other hand, intuition is one of the key concepts in the modeling of human-robot collaborations. It is one of the concepts that migrate from the fields of humanities and cognitive sciences into robotics and AI when it comes to program and simulate the actions of organic and non-organic agents. But what does it actually mean to design an intuitive behavior towards a human co-worker? What kind of bodily knowledge has to be made explicit to communicate a familiarity of the non-organic agent with the human way to move, to gesture, and finally to work? Taking this into account, intuition could also be grasped as a metaphor for fluid and effective interactions with robots. But I would like to argue that especially in the models and practices of human-robot collaborations, the situation is a bit more complex. Herein, the concept of intuition does not simply mean man-machine interactions as sequences of stimulus and response. It entails practices of modeling, simulation, and materialization of human-robot relationships in which the innate capacity of intuition is constantly mediated between a bodily explicit and a tacit knowledge, as Michael Polanyi has called it. Thus, in this sense, I argue that collaborative robots are not only programmed to meet the expectations of their human partner. Their body techniques also affect the assumed inner space of human intuition through practices of formalized body movements and haptic gestures. This entails 2 points. First, the making explicit of the so-called tacit knowledge of bodily routine practices, which turns intuition from the gut instinct into a modus operandi. Second, a new conceptualization of the interface beyond computer screens and displays onto an in-between space, separating and binding two ontologically heterogeneous agents committed to work together. I will explain my argument as follows. First, I will sum up some definitions of intuition from psychology and philosophy to show that the question of the explicit and tacit knowledge is already embedded in intuition with the idea of a mediated immediacy. Second, I will show why the concept of intuition is so important in human-robot collaborations and why it cannot be reduced to its functionalistic implications. And finally, I will conclude with a case study in which robotic engineers constructed a robot to carry a table with his human partner. In this task execution, the coding of intuitive haptics does not only regulate the sequence of actions, but also the social roles each of the collaborator has, either as the leader or the follower of the movement. So I come to my second point, which is a bit more historical. Mediated immediacy, the magic of intuition. Derived from the Latin word intuere, intuition means to consider something, but also, and especially, and this is quite important for this term, in the medieval translations, to contemplate. In a general sense, a better understanding of what intuition might be can be given in precising what it is not. Means a discursive formation to describe the world, to represent something and therefore to activate something that mediates between the subject and the object, like concepts, paintings, or symbols. From this point of view, one could trace the idea back to Plato's Eidos and throughout the medieval philosophy. But with regard to the modern age, intuition has obtained a central role as the unmediated access to truth and therefore also to the self. This clear, non-synthetic insight is made explicit in Descartes' Rules for the Direction of the Mind, when he writes, and I quote, "Intuition is the unduplicable conception of a clear and attentive mind, which proceeds solely from the light of reason," unquote. The light of reason is here close to an Augustine and Platonic sense of seeing the intelligible things. In the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, however, as a representative for the Enlightenment, this God-given light of reason has nothing to do with intuition anymore. For him, intuition means to synthesize the received manifold impressions of our sensibility to a representation. Through the a priori forms of intuition, space and time, we can be sensually affected by objects and subsume our impressions through intuition, which in German is the pretty popular or widespread concept of reine Anschauung. So the intuitive use of reason is here again opposed to the discursive, which necessitates the concepts. But, and this is an important turn, without explicit intuition, no conceptions of our representations can be made. Finally, Kant's use of intuition defines an access to the world which is only mediated through our sensibility. It does neither depend on a cogito nor on a special quality of the world outside. Without the intuitive access to the world, there can be no judgments about the world. We see already with these examples from the modern age and the Enlightenment that intuition maintains its enchantment as the unmediated access to the world. In the late 19th and 20th century, philosophers like Henri Bergson or Edmund Husserl take the concept of intuition up to distinguish a specific way of accessing knowledge, whether through memory, as in the case of Henri Bergson, or through the rejection of an unproblematic existence of the world, as Edmund Husserl did it with his concept of the epoche. But I won't deepen this here, because this would also take in charge a closer look at how these philosophers have positioned themselves against the analytic concepts of science that came up in the 19th century and all the sciences that have institutionalized in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. But I won't do this here. However, in all these cases, there is a special technique of thinking which must be made explicit, but which also withdraws from analytic concepts. And this is, I think, a crucial point concerning the concept of intuition. This kind of ambiguous position between this making explicit of a special technique of thinking, but also this withdrawing from a straight logical analytic conceptualization or method. This line can be drawn further, although under different aspects in the use of intuition in the pedagogy of the 20th century. Here, ideas like the intuitive pedagogy for adults promise the playful access to life itself through playing, making, music, or painting. Again, the semantics of the non-discursive, the unplanned, but also unmediated and direct manner to experience the outside world reappear here as they were in the philosophy of enlightenment. And not least, intuition has played a major role in the behavioral economics. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed with their research about gambling behavior in lotteries in 1981 an alternative to the utility theory that always presupposes the homo economicus. Here, intuition also defines an, and I quote, informal and unstructured mode of reasoning without the use of analytic methods or deliberate calculation, unquote. Today, we can see an enormous number of investment guidebooks who promise to optimize, and especially through analytics, this assumed intuitive way of decision making. And this is what I would like to call upon here with this slide. This is a classical slide when you Google intuition. You do not have to precise it with regard to decision making, but if you Google intuition, it's always this kind of magical way to get into a decision making with capabilities that not everybody has, which have to be kind of trained, which have to be built with a special technique, but which is kind of pretty resistant to something like a classical methodological approach. So the questions are, for example, how to measure intuition. However, in this kind of short philosophical and psychological background, the meaning of intuition always promises an unmediated immediacy as the access to the world, while at the same time one can observe a long discourse around the question what the techniques of intuition might be. And that's the point where I will go over to the robotic engineers, to my third point, intuition in human-robot collaborations. So with this background of intuition in philosophy and the modern approaches in pedagogy and psychology, one understands better the effect of semantics like intuition as the direct, unmediated insight. In the case of human-robot collaborations, the use of intuition does not exhaust as a design goal, but refers to a new concept of interface. But first, what does it mean to design intuitive behavior in robots? In the last 10 to 15 years, a huge amount of papers has been published in industrial and social robotics about the so-called natural, intuitive, and enjoyable ways of interaction, as Cynthia Brazil, the so-called pioneer of social robotics, has described it. Besides the diverse ways of anthropomorphizing robots, the regulation of presence plays an important role. In the case of the famous MIT robot Kismet, Brazil describes this regulation of companionship as, I quote, paralinguistic cues, like the exchange of gestures, the shifts in gazes, and the precise timing of eye blinks. So here's a photo from a very young Cynthia Brazil with this kind of, with one of the first models of Kismet. All these non-verbal techniques of communication should enable a fluid, undisturbed interaction. The notion of collaboration goes a bit further in indicating a working together to achieve a common goal. In this sense, it is not only the way of being situated together to maintain a communication, but to read the intentions of the other, to negotiate and renegotiate one's actions. But what does it mean for a human to negotiate intentions with a collaborative autonomous agent? To answer this question, intuition must be modeled and materialized. In both practices, it turns into a modus operandi in which the interface represents the materialization of changing social roles between the leader and the follower of an action. This includes new differentiations between a tacit knowledge as a bodily technique of knowing how and formalizations of bodily techniques as a knowing that. And this is a crucial distinction here made by Michael Polanyi already in the 1960s, and to which he refers to as the logic of tacit knowledge. A classic example for this logic of tacit knowledge concerning human-robot collaborations is the task of carrying a table by two agents. And I refer here to two projects, one from a French group of engineers from Montpellier and one from a group of the Technical University Munich, who both constructed autonomous robots that should learn how to execute this task. And I am starting with the French group. Here, to move the table with the human partner, the robot should not react to fixed cues of a follower or a leader, but to transition probabilities. Through online calculation of the sensed haptic cues, the robot recognizes the intentions of its human partner and must interpret them and also try to anticipate the next movement so that it can finally negotiate, and I quote again, its own programmed intentions, unquote. And for example, one of these intentions could be how to deposit the table in an ergonomically favorable position. So, simple tasks, simple intentions. The successive body postures should be carried out through smooth recommendations, communicated through, and I quote again, internal forces as hypothetical haptic cues, unquote. To formalize these haptic cues, the French engineers used a mathematical model called homotopy switching after the mathematical principle of homotopy. Homo as the same and topos as place means that two different functions from the above function and the function down at the bottom, the two different functions describe homotopic equivalent spaces that constantly deform into one another between 2 points. Herein, leading and following becomes for the robot a question of calculated transition probabilities. So, to avoid the two hierarchical extremes of follower and leader, the formalization of bodily techniques does not only refer to a fluid conduction of intentions into body postures. It entails the practice of delegation, and these transition probabilities in between the two functions are the kind of calculative space for the anthropological concept of delegation, as I interpret it. Delegation for the human agent as a part of collaboration implies the transference of intentionality into non-living objects, something Sigmund Freud once described as uncanny when referring to our, and I quote, primitive forebears, unquote, and their belief in animism. But whilst for our primitive forebears, ritual practices should enliven the non-living object, in the case of homotopy switching, one has to rely on the learning algorithm of the autonomous agent and the coding of haptics. So, beyond the obvious goal to design a collaboration, there is also the anthropological point of constructing trust in robots through intuition as an operative technique. A second example with the same collaborative task comes from a team of the engineers, as I said, from the Technical University Munich. The team conceives 3 possible collaborative situations, and they can be seen here. The standard situation, which is on top, the standard situation where the voluntary effort of the agent is equally shared, the so-called balanced policy effort, one in which the robot takes the lead effort and one where the human takes it. The difficulty now is to program the anticipation of human kinesthetics for the robot. Hence, how strong a wrench by the human partner might be, how many degrees of freedom one must include into the model, as well as the question of thresholds for the weighting of the role as follower or leader are all of importance. Additionally, this presupposes visual sensors of detecting the position of the object, as well as several sensors in the end effectors to sense the haptic cues of the human. But in the same way, these cues are also incoming data that must be encoded regarding the correlations of local parameters. And right now, I'm getting a bit more into the technical background, but I think we can keep it pretty simple, because we all the time are referring to this basic example of follower and leader in the task of carrying a table. The robot has to learn from false anticipations, but to do this, the program has to encode the local correlations of variables and constraints from the incoming data, and that means to determine the areas of movement with variability and areas with constraints, where the variability is very low. For example, the robot should not wrench the table too much towards the human or sink it too quickly. To avoid such movements, the program runs the so-called estimation maximization algorithm, abbreviated EM algorithm. The EM algorithm considers the data sets as incomplete, which means that at the beginning of the calculation, neither the parameters of the variables are known nor the definite source of the data. Or, to put it more bluntly, who is the agent of this movement and what could be a parameter for a force threshold, for example. So, if you imagine this in a pretty pictorial way, what we had with the homotopy switching, this is the movement in transition. And the red points are the model, and the yellow points are the incoming data. And what happens right now is that the EM algorithm calculates a probability for each possible parameter and the probability from what source he might come from the follower or the leader. And what the animation would have shown is that you would see a strong a strong movement of the red points and the red circle, which would be the model. And the yellow points would be the incoming data. And then after a while, when the algorithm is running, the red points would shrink together and take on the same form as the yellow points, which means that the model, as the EM algorithm runs, converges with the incoming data, which means that this probability distribution of the actions is going on, and it's in this kind of iterations. You could say that it is learning in this kind of way. And this estimation maximization algorithm is quite popular here in robotics, but it stems from economy and statistics. So, coming back to this simple task. Consequently, the question here is less whether the intuitive knowledge of body postures and haptic cues can be attributed to a subject, but after the formalization in the model and the calculation through algorithms as the EM, whether it can be embodied in the collaboration with the human. The online calculations of the robot render possible the suggestions of trajectories to carry the table and therefore to execute the collaboration in different ways. Herein, the knowing that of the robot's performance entangles with the knowing that of the human's tacit knowledge. Thus, the conceptualization of the interface does not only belong to the displays of computers where the results of the algorithms are displayed, but also to the table as the medium of materialized negotiation in man-robot collaborations. Intuition constitutes here an operative mode of transition between states of leading and being led in a task, of feeling and being felt by the other agent through the haptic codes and kinesthetics. Thus the partner notices the wrenches or jerks of his collaborator. Does he signal something or does he just hesitate? Okay. 2 minutes? In such simple but ambiguous situations, the modeling of a haptic dialogue, as Paul Evra, one of the mentioned French engineers, coined it, and the algorithmic calculations represent the complex of what I entitled the encoding of proximity. Intuition, this resort of human effects as the non-analytic reasoning, turns hereby to an operational mode of formalization of tacit knowledge and its re-implementation into situations of ambiguous agency. Hence, intuition is highly mediated and not centered around human feelings or cognitive acts. Moreover, regarding the encoding of proximity, it marks an access to a world where the notions of autonomy, trust, and sovereignty are more and more entangled with media technologies of regulating effects. In this sense, the proximity of robots does not only have to point out to the possible replacements of humans by machines, it also opens up a way to conceptualize something like an operative autonomy, a conception of autonomy highly fragile and in transition, but depending on a tacit bodily knowledge. And I come to my very short conclusion. Point 4. The human gut instinct of intuition does not find itself anymore in the depths of human thinking. In our embodied media habits, intuitive gestures belong meanwhile to a tacit user knowledge. It has not to be discussed, demonstrations are enough. Moreover, intuition turns also into an operative mode that constitutes new in-between spaces, where the interfaces, like the carried table, become the materialization of an algorithmic proximity. This does not lead to another turn of hybridized embodiments, but to human-robot practices who involve the formalization of gestures, the encoding of semantics of routine bodily practices, and of haptic codes for social questions of leading and being led, as well as the numerous indefinite states of transition, as demonstrated by the homotopic model. To describe the phenomena of human-robot collaborations as techno-enthusiasm would be therefore short-sighted. Instead, the formalization of tacit bodily knowledge retroacts on the social space. In other words, sensing and reading human bodies means to model environments where the human is the environment. With this shift, the encoding of proximity becomes also a research object for new ways of describing human-centered concepts like autonomy and sovereignty in bodily practices. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, David. A little bit too long, but I will give you another 10 minutes for discussion. So are there questions, comments?
Very short question.
Yeah, can take you the microphone. Just wait a moment.
A very short question. I didn't get it. Who's becoming the environment for the robot? Did you say human are becoming the environment for the robot? In this tacit knowledge formalization, because the forest that's what you mean.
Yes, indeed.
Martina.
Short question according to the notion of the interface. So you said that the table is the interface, and this is because the humans become the environment.
In this interaction, yeah, the table becomes the interface as the materialization of this task, yeah, and the roles that are negotiated in this task. But from the point of view of the engineers, as programming the anticipation of something which would be the haptic cues and the kinesthetics of the human is the environment for the robot. Yeah.
Here, Andrew.
Well, thank you for the presentation. This is really interesting and way outside my scope, my knowledge, so entirely new to me. And as a result, I think my question is sort of very much outside this, the terms of your research. But I'm just curious, someone who often misreads social cues and maybe is accused of being what in English we might call socially awkward. I'm curious. It seems to me in human interactions we have some flexibility to forgive others of those misread cues and misperceived intuitions or faulty intuitions. And I just wonder if in your field there's any sort of discussion or reflection on whether that element of flexibility will evolve with the advancements in robotics, or whether it's, it seems like the premise of the research is very much about establishing sort of robotic sort of conformity to these human-centered expectations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I got you. On the one hand, of course, one could trace it as a try to formalize human instincts or human expectations. This is the one way, and one could also say anthropomorphize the robot. But what I wanted to show is also that in this discussion or in this discourse, there's always this kind of thinking about, or a kind of what I call the retroacting of these kind of key concepts, anthropological key concepts like delegation and sovereignty, that is a kind of feedback effect of these tasks and of the performance of these tasks, whether they are realized or not. But this is something that in this discourse it's implemented there, and I think that the robotic engineers, as far as they use these concepts like intuition, they have, of course, that's not in their perception. But the point is that from a media studies point of view, you can really trace this kind of feedback effects. And also in the question what and why and how can be something like this tacit bodily practices be made explicit, and how does it change through these through these tasks and through the materialization of these tasks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like the externalization of the intuition in the entity environment. The notion is very nice and clever, but is the anthropomorphization which is implicit in this whole notion of intuition, doesn't it stand in the way for us to understand what really happens inside the algorithm or inside the robot? But inside, outside the automatic itself, I know, but is intuition too charged, as it was stated, too charged philosophical and humanitarian notions to really understand what is happening there? This is a problem with all these notions, which are always entangled in this
I answer shortly, maybe. If I get you right, you see the danger that, as describing it with the concept of intuition, one could fall into the trap that this is just another kind of anthropomorphization. Okay, so and my point is exactly I would say on the other side, that this is a kind of practice where one can show how this kind of fixed anthropocentric concept kind of being dissolved, not by the robotic practices as they go on, but as they are described and as they retroact on these concepts. I think the point is less to say that this is a fixed definition of this concept. The point is to say that looking at these practices and how the kind of formalization of practices retroacts on the expectation of intuition. I think that would be more precisely on the expectation of intuition and not on a certain definition of intuition.
Richard?
Just very quickly, picking up on a couple of questions. You talked about the human becoming the environment for the robot. I wonder how much of this is specific to robotic technology and how much of it is related to our interactions with technologies of all sorts. McLuhan famously says that when you're in a canoe, that the rower or the canoer, the Indian, I believe is how he says it, becomes the servo mechanism of the canoe. And so there's a way in which in something tasks like rowing a boat, we are also involved in this kind of intuitive reaction. We become the environment in a sense. So do you see that as identical, as related, or is not?
I answer quickly. There are certain similar points, but I see a big difference between that because this example of this canoe is a kind of also an extension of the human nervous system, and it presupposes a pretty sharp concept of the organics of a human organism, and I do not see this here, but that's my short answer.
Okay, I have two more. First Pierre, and then Irina, and this is the last one. Then I have to close this.
Picking up on Andrew's question, it seems we are giving the robot more difficult tasks than we would give a human. If I'm carrying a table with my friend, we still have language, and we don't only rely on our expectation or this kind of haptic negotiation. My friend would tell me, we go left, and if we do, and it seems this language kind of may be used to correct misinterpretation on the haptic level. So in a way, are we not expecting of the robot more than we would be expecting of the human? A kind of perfect social expectation, which we would not expect from a human, because we have this.
Of course not.
We do not expect for a human, because precisely we can correct through language, apologize.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. Of course, this is true. But in this, as I said, in this situational case, where there's no this kind of speech and talking, maybe if the robot could talk, things would be different. But the point is that it is here something that is kind of automatically, in a sense, expected how to move this. Of course, you can start a conversation, but I think the funny point here is, and we have no speech, that through this practice and through this kind of mechanic posture, that it's a pretty mechanical work, that you have to formalize this tacit knowledge. And this, I don't know if it's more that we put into the robot than we expect from the human. It's just other ways of communicating, because we're communicating with another system. But of course, one could speculate how this would change if the robot would be able to speak. But for me, that's not so much the important point. The important point is more how these practices change these conceptualizations of intuition.
Don't you think it's totally cybernetic, biocybernetic, and it relies on these homostat concepts? Because you also say, for me it sounds very, very like that. And then these kind of intuition and intention, I thought that's very interesting because it's also about decision making. And yeah, well, is there a homostatic concept of intuition that you already looked at this? Because for me it's totally a homostat, what you showed us there, as a model of what they try to, or at their way to formalize that what they call intuition.
I make it short. I think the point is that the homostat would be kind of, you can put it as an ideal, but it's also kind of in this state thing. But that's why I said this kind of transition probabilities. There is no kind of ideal homostatic point. It's more like this going left and right besides this the homostatic point. And the other thing is that the concept of the homostatic is a pretty organism and environment related term, and I refer here to tacit knowledge of bodily practices, which is I think different phenomenon. So it's not much about the organism-environment relations.